Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Let's try this again tonight and see how well we go. I am Abe with Mystic Jen Mara, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight it's going to be a delayed stream because last night I was supposed to do Occult and Crochet, but due to technical difficulties, I'm still not exactly sure what happened. We'll be doing it tonight instead. So, let me find my notes here. Here we go. That's way too big. Okay, shrink these down where I can actually see them. So tonight is going to be an interesting one, for me anyway. I personally find this particular topic surprising, to say the least, just because of who and what. Sorry, I wasn't sure how this was going to go, so I wanted to make sure that it got uploaded correctly first. Now, okay. The gentleman I would like to speak of tonight is Emanuel Swedenborg. So, the first time I even heard about this, I'm just not making sure everything's still going, was from a, and this is my not so secret obsession, but it was a horror TV series directed by Stephen King, and it starred a lot of really big people for the time that it was going, because this was in the early 2000s. I think it was 2003, 2004, somewhere in there. And it had actors like Diane Ladd, amazing actress by the way, Bruce Davidson. If you have not seen anything with him, I highly recommend it. He can play the most gentle, amazing, polite person, and then he can play the guy in this movie. So he has a really broad range. He was actually in the first, back in the early 2000s, there was a movie called Dahmer that came out, Jeffrey Dahmer's story, and he was the dad in it. And he plays the part really well as kind of a low-key, stern but not hateful, but, you know, that type of person. And that was one of my introductions to him, was that movie and then this TV series. And I'm just kind of giving you some background here. And then the other one, and I believe it was 90210, is Andrew McCarthy, and he's in this, and he plays an amazing part in this movie. And of course, being Stephen King, he makes an appearance as well. And at the time I was watching this, I was really deep into Stephen King's writings, and so when I found out that he didn't just do a movie or a mini-series, this was a 13-episode TV series. It was a full season. And I didn't get to watch it on normal TV, but as soon as it came out on DVD, I bought it. I didn't even watch it, I bought it outright. Because it was for mainstream TV. It's not gory by any stretch, but it has this slow burn, this like back of the neck psychological thing to it. And of course, because it was based off of a European, I think British, horror opera, but they did it in the style of the Greek tragedy. So you have ups, you have downs, you have comedy, you have, jump scares. So it turns out to be rather entertaining across the board. You feel like spooky, it's spooky. You feel like funny, it's funny. There's a really oddball romance stream thread throughout. It's just a good movie, and it's a series. It takes about 13 hours, 14 hours, something like that. It's linked in the description below if you are into something a little bit more unique. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. In this movie, they are extremely focused on a term called Swedenborgian space. I thought it was made up, and I just had this inkling, like the back of your head thing, where you're like, you should Google that and see what pops up. And I did. And what I found shocked me, because this gentleman, Emanuel Swedenborg, actually developed a lot of what we now view as the ether or the astral plane, and really, without meaning to, kicked open the doors for a lot of alternative thinking about how the Bible really was written and what it was intentional, or what it was originally implied for, according to him, and how basically we've been told some untruths over the years. But what I found was this was a real person. He had a real impact on people's beliefs in his lifetime and after, and he adjusted how people viewed the afterlife in a very significant way. I will get into some of that. I have not read a lot of his work. He was an extremely prolific writer, and I have linked several of the firsts because he wrote a lot of series books. I've linked a bunch of them in the description, and as we go through here, I'll reference the ones, for the most part, that I have linked below. I personally have only read a couple of his. The stuff that I have read has been eye-opening, to say the least. I don't have the copies with me. They're in my storage unit with the rest of my library, which one day I hope to have as my backdrop instead of tapestries, but we'll get into that later. Anyway, so who was Emanuel Swedenborg? Well, we're going to start with his original name, Emanuel Swedenborg. He was born in February of 1688. His date of birth was actually the 8th of February, which happens to be tomorrow. So this actually was not my plan. I'd written all this down and scheduled it out in December, but I didn't pay attention to, because I only started researching him in January, but I'd already set the date for this one. It's supposed to be yesterday, but we'll go with what we have. So his birthday is literally tomorrow, so that was kind of ironic or synchronistic for it to be on this day. Not much is said about his mother, but considering it was in the 1600s, women were not as important to a lot of the culture at the time, unfortunately. But his father was big important. He was a bishop of Skara, Sweden. His father was Jesper Swedenborg, a descendant from a family made wealthy by the mining industry of the time. Jesper had an interesting life, and it was his teaching that stemming from the Pietist Lutheran sects that strongly influenced Emanuel's later beliefs and practices. Jesper believed that the spirits and angels were active in our lives every single day. Not far off from how I view it, and a lot of people who find this type of content view it. This would lead you to believe that Emanuel had a really good childhood, if not a very strict religious childhood. Between 1703 and 1709, when Emanuel was around the age of 15 to 21, he studied at Uppsala and graduated in 1709, which was a university. And, where am I here? Around 1710, he landed in London. Quite the little jaunt for someone who's born and raised in Sweden. During this time, London was the center of science. Emanuel was fascinated and studied physics, philosophy, and mechanics while his time in London progressed. He read amazing amounts of poetry. The reference was massive amounts of poetry, so that could have been, depending on who you were, a lot or nothing. And he also began to write his own poetry during this time. I will say that it was his starting of writing poetry that I think, personally, led him to being such an accomplished author in both the spiritual arts and the mechanical and mining arts. It was significant. Oddly enough, when you Google him now and you look at his body of works, the majority of it is about his spiritual work, but from what I had observed, it was a significant amount of contribution to physics of the time, which is like extremely basic to us today, and engineering and natural sciences, but he wrote very prolifically even within that department, and it did influence that area for its time quite heavily. But what we think about today is with Emanuel Swedenborg is his later work. Returning back to Sweden, his hometown, in 1715 at the age of 27, he put his studies into practice for around 20 years or so. And I say around because the dates are a little bit interesting. They don't, depending on what source you read, some say it was an exact 20-year period, others say it was 20 to 30. We'll go with approximately 20. He worked with natural sciences and engineering heavily during this time, and he wanted to build an observatory because of his research that he was doing. The then King of Sweden, Charles the 12th, I am horrible with Roman numerals, preferred making war to making science. But the king did appoint Emanuel to be the assessor extraordinary, and I had to really look that up because I'm like, what is an assessor extraordinary? Is a really good assessor? That is what I thought. What I could find out was this was the head assessor for an office, and it was like he answered directly to the king is what it looked like. And he was made the assessor extraordinary on the Swedish Board of Mines, which was headquartered at that time in Stockholm, Sweden. During this time, he pushed the study of science and progressed in his scientific writings. He challenged, not in massive ways, but he challenged what was currently being done and pushed it forward and pushed it forward. So his work really did broaden the field of science for the time, which was impressive because his mind was very focused on growth and how to understand the core. If you can see how things work underneath, you can build it up, and that's pretty much how it looks like he worked through a lot of this stuff. It was during this 20 or so year period that he started to use science to explain spiritual and, oddly enough, mental occurrences, and naming these various events tremulations. And this was a way to explain the minute, the very small vibrations that affect the human mind and spirit. He even published an article about this topic in 1718. And what we would call the energy fields, the auras, EMFs even today. This was the type of stuff during his time, not so much the EMFs, but using the energy fields of the body and the biosphere to adjust to the human body and mind. This was the stuff that he was starting to take note of. This was when he was still very much in his scientific type of mind, so he hadn't gotten fully into spirit, but this was kind of a foretelling of what was going to come soon. Let me scroll up here. So in 1718, though, and this is an interesting coincidence, in 1718 he published the article about it. Also in 1718, King Charles the 12th died, and his wife became ruling queen. And this name was so difficult, and it took me a minute to actually hear it correctly. I'll probably still say it wrong. Ulrika and Eleonora went about ennobling the Swedenborg siblings. With the new noble title came the new name, the name that we know today, which was Swedenborg. It was a custom during this time in history to ennoble the children of prominent bishops. It was pretty much like, oh, you're a bishop in the church, you're doing good work, let's make all of your kids noblemen. I looked around trying to find where this started, like some point to this, but it was basically a way for the church and the government at the time to gain favor with each other is what it looked like. So one supported the other, the type of stuff that bothers me to this day, but that's kind of what it looks like was happening. I couldn't find exact rules for it or purposes, but that's what the implication was. Let me grab a drink. By the 1730s, Emanuel's interests had started to turn to the study of body and brain. This was his natural sciences bent coming forward. He referenced what we would call a neuron today. He had a different word for it. It was in Swedish. I didn't even try. He wrote about the various aspects of the brain and their functions, and he actually developed the rudimentary views of the cerebral cortex, the pituitary gland, and other aspects of the brain, and started to understand what the purpose of each part was. This was huge for the time, because at this time you still had people, bleeding and leeching and thinking that was the way to do stuff, and he's like, you have this computer between your ears that does a lot of things too. Some of his theories have been tested in our modern days, and What's I find ironic or interesting, like this guy really was tapped into some bigger flow. The things that he had theorized in the 1730s, they have tested in the last 50 years, and not all of it, because they haven't tested everything yet, but they have tested a fair amount of it, and what they've found is he was more spot on than people in between 1730 and like 1955-ish. He knew more at that time that we're just now starting to understand what these aspects of the brain are. He was so far ahead of his time. It was kind of surprising. Like I said, when I first heard about it, I thought, what kind of weird stuff is this? And then I started looking into him, and when I started reading some of his work, first of all, I'll give you all heads up. It is intense. He tries to write it for the common man of the time, but he wrote it all in Latin, which it's been translated into I don't know how many different languages now. So Latin to English is not exactly the easiest thing to understand, but that's what they did. A couple of the things that I've linked down below are written in a new style, so it's been moderately edited. Trying to find direct edits or direct translations was a bit of a difficulty, and the ones that I did find were in hardcover editions, and they ranged from $80 to several $100 per volume. So I shared the stuff that was a little bit cheaper for you guys, and there's some Kindle editions of stuff too. Anyway, moving on. And just as a side note, if you click through these links below, there is a little bit of kickback that I get. You don't pay anything extra, but it is a way to support the stream. So just as a thank you for that. But this is where we get into what I wanted to introduce you to with Emanuel, was his mind-spirit work. Emanuel wanted to find a way to explain spiritual matters using the science of the time. He started by attempting to mix philosophy and I always say this wrong, the study of metalworking in writing, which garnered him a little bit of fame in the mining world for the section that he did on smelting copper and iron. This work was published the same year, 1735 or so, as another work he wrote where he attempted to explain how we are connected to our souls and our finite consciousness is bound and connected to the infinite awareness. This is where it all begins for him. He took a leave from work as the assessor extraordinaire at the age of 55 to work on his research into how the soul was part of the body's anatomy, which was not something that anyone even thought about at that time. He wanted to write over 15 volumes on just this subject. The first book is linked in the description below. Did I not put down that book? The book was titled On the Infinite, was one of his. But the other one is The Animal Kingdom or the Kingdom of Life. That's his 15-book series, which I have linked book 1 down below. The one thing with that one, I will just give you the heads up, they've condensed it. I think it's 8 volumes now, and I think the original was like 14. So it was a significantly massive work. So after he left this work, let's see if I have any chats going on. Sorry, I didn't even think about it. Doesn't look like it. Okay. After he left his day job, basically, he started to have dreams as he started down this path, doing this more intensive research. Being the type of person that he was, a researcher, a scientist, he wrote down everything. So he journaled the dreams during this approximately 1-year period. His dream journals were thought to be lost by the mainstream, but then in the 1850s, the Royal Library of Sweden just happened to have all of them. Because when he died, being in the employ of the royalty, everything, from what I've understood, went straight to them, and it was basically that all of his writings were kind of stuck in a box and shoved to the back. Well, he had talked about these dreams and to other people, and so there was always this rumor about these journals being somewhere, and they actually did find them, and they were authenticated as his handwriting analysis and all that fun stuff. And they were published soon after. They were found in the 1850s and are actually out there for us to read. And that I did link that one below. It's not very big. Let me rephrase. Considering who I'm talking about, this journal wasn't as long as some of the other works. I think in the modern version of it, it's like 300 pages, where everything else that he wrote, and even in modern day where it's been a little bit adjusted, condensed, however you want to phrase it, we're still talking per book about 400 to 900 pages per volume. That's not per set of books. That's one book. He didn't do anything small. In 1745, Emanuel's world changed. He had completed the Journal of Dreams, and he'd started to understand the wild dreams' meaning. And that wasn't a small feat. He felt that there was a battle between love of himself and the love of God playing out in these dreams, and that he journaled. He landed once again in London, as he had been traveling around, and had an experience while having dinner out. And this was an interesting one. This was one of his various, and I'll mention a few of his others later on, but he started having visions and impressions. The spirit world was coming forward to actually communicate with him because he was opening himself up to the knowledge. He'd landed in London and had an experience while having dinner. In this experience, he had a vision of a being, didn't specify who or what at this point, coming to him and telling him not to eat too much. Random, but it scared Emanuel enough for him to excuse himself from the dinner that he was at and rush home, not knowing what was going on. Later that night, his vision came back to him. The being that showed up introduced himself as the Lord, capital L, and that the Lord had come to show him the deeper and true meaning of the Bible. After that night, the spiritual world was Emanuel's only focus in life. By 1747, Emanuel had fully resigned his position on the mining board with the court. During this time, he took up the research, study, and education of the Hebrew language so that he could understand the spiritual meanings of the Bible itself. Not oddly enough, in Latin, he wanted to understand what the Yiddish was. Over a decade or so, he wrote the book that would make his career in the mystic world. The book was titled Arcana Coelestia, or The Secrets of Heaven. This massive work was in several volumes, the first of which I did link below. And you can still find the Latin version of it, so if you read Latin, not Italian, Latin, you can probably pick that up somewhere. It's not cheap. The ones I was finding online, even used, were going for several $100s per volume, and it was a several volume set. So, what I thought was interesting, in the original 8 volumes, Emanuel wrote and published them anonymously because he wasn't sure how this would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Because I didn't write it down. He didn't know how this would be interpreted by the general public. And since he already had a very big name within the mining and metal community, he wasn't sure if he should stick his name on this just yet. Spirit hadn't worked on him enough. We'll just go with that one. The excuse I saw that the message was not being understood because it was too intense or too deep for the average person. During his lifetime, these texts gained minimal attention. It popped up to a few people, but it wasn't like broad ranging. Like some of the stuff you would have thought in his day, even being published anonymously, this would have exploded onto the religious scene, but it didn't. At that time, I think 4 denominations, Catholicism, Lutheranism, Lutherans, and there's I think two others at the time, and I can't remember exactly, but they had such a stranglehold on religion and spirituality, and I say that not to be demeaning. It was basically, if they didn't agree with it, you didn't hear about it. So what else? What other term would you like me to use? Between 1747 until his death in 1772, I believe he was 84, he wrote an additional 14 books, all pertaining to the realm of spirit. He claimed that he'd witnessed some amazing events, including the beginning of the final judgment in the space between heaven and hell. In the space between. So there's heaven, there's hell. This was where the battle was taking place, and he was able to witness it. He saw the beginning of the final judgment. In this in-between realms that all souls must pass on their journey before they can even find out if they're going to heaven or hell, they go to this space. In the Kingdom Hospital show, the one I referenced that Stephen King directed, they referenced this as Swedenborgian space, the between space, between time, out of space. He asserted that this judgment was started because the church of that day had lost the faith of God and the charity for their fellow man. Therefore, the time for the divine intervention was necessary, and in his opinion, that's when it began, was during that 30-year period or so. So I wonder what he would think if he could see the world and the various churches that he knew at his time and what they were doing today. Emanuel claimed that as he conversed with the spirits from various planets within our solar system, he said the spirits told him that there are several heavens, and his theory was, why not? God is unlimited, so why should he limit himself to humanity? That's kind of the opposite of what the reality is. That's that whole, this is my opinion, by the way, that's that whole let's make God in our image, not God making us in his image, because we take God and put him into a box. This is what God can do, this is what God is, this is the heaven, this is the hell, this is where we like everything cut, dried, there it is. Emanuel's visions, and he had massive amounts of them, said throw that entire paradigm out the window. You are limiting what God is. You are limiting what God is capable of. Your views, and this was kind of the way he didn't word it. This is how I interpret what he said. The view of humanity, of how we interpret, see, and explain God, is how we interpret, see, and explain ourselves. We do not even begin to understand the breadth of an unlimited deity. It's beyond our comprehension. And that was his point in a lot of what he was doing, was he was going to explain how we were basically trying to limit what God was capable of, and talk about some arrogance as humanity for us to be doing that, which is one of the things I rail against in a lot of spiritual arguments, if you've ever had one with me. But his view was not that humanity in and of itself was evil, but we are not, emphasis on not, the only beings in our galaxy and in our solar system. He spoke with, according to the literature that I had found, I want to read the book because he actually details this out in one of his books, and I want to actually read this one just because I think it might help me understand astrology. But he talked to planets from Mercury, or to the spirits of Mercury, the intelligences of Mercury, of Venus, Mars, and Jupiter were the ones that I saw for sure. And there are beings, not humans, but there are beings on each of those planets. And that is what he was describing as Earth and humanity has its heaven. Straight up, that's where our heaven is. Mars and its entities have their heaven. Venus and their entities have their heaven. Once we achieve the heavenly field, in a lot of our modern day terms, we would call it the fourth dimension or fourth density, then we can interact with each other because we're on to a spiritual plane where we're all kind of the same. But in our third density awareness, their energy fields and our energy fields are almost incompatible. Like, we can't really see each other, is how he was, how it's described. Like I said, I really want to read these books because I think his views on the galaxy and on other species is going to be fascinating. So, sorry, peppermint tea just keeps my voice soothed. In his final work, and this is again not small, the title is The True Christian Religion, linked below if you're interested. He condensed his philosophy. He hated that word, by the way. He wanted it to be an understanding. Philosophy is what people did without thought, and I'll go into that in a little bit later, or without action. It's linked in 2 books, and I linked both of them because if you're going to read one, just as well read the other because there's a lot. And as I've said before, this guy did not write small volumes of anything. Each book in this set, so there's 2 books, but each book is over 400 pages. I think one is like 482 and the other one's 465. So even in paperback, your book's going to be like 2.5 inches thick. These are huge. But the book was his way to explain his new evolved beliefs to the everyday Christian. Emanuel Swedenborg's influence in life was surprisingly vast. He influenced the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley. From what I had dug through, and I went and checked several places because I'm like, this sounds weird. But it was verified through a couple of different sources that were not like, well, this source quoted this source. No, there was a lot of them that talked about it and they weren't connected. John Wesley had been interested in Emanuel Swedenborg's work, his writings, but had never met Emanuel. But he always wanted to. That was the thing, is that he thought that his view of the Bible, as interpreted through his work, was spot on, and it really did strongly influence Wesley to step away from the religion he was in and kind of develop the whole concept of the Methodist Church. And it's not based entirely on Swedenborg's work, but there's a lot of influence that goes along with that. Emanuel, at one point, because spirits had been communicating with him and telling him that John Wesley was looking interested, he wanted to meet John Wesley, and it totally surprised Wesley because everything that I've found, Wesley had not told anybody that he was reading Swedenborg's work. He was mainstream Christian at the time, which was like Lutheran Catholic or what the other ones were, I can't remember. And Swedenborg was basically upending the entire belief system. So it could have been, in theory, heretical for John Wesley to even be opening these books, let alone studying them. And he had not, at this point, contacted Emanuel, but Emanuel knew who John Wesley was, which is, I couldn't find how he knew. But John Wesley commented after Emanuel's death on a massive amount of Swedenborg's work. But Emanuel had written to him and said, hey, let's meet. We need to talk. Spirits have been talking to me. Now I need to talk to you because they've been telling me about you, so we need to talk. And unfortunately, I did not get... Anyway, I only put like footnotes to this. Unfortunately, John Wesley was on a tour doing some other work and said, I'll get to you in a minute. And and Emanuel said, if you don't meet me now, by the time you are back from your journey, I will no longer be here. This will be my death. And I believe it was March 29th. And John Wesley kind of almost poo-pooed it, like, yeah, okay, crazy old man, you predicted your own death. Yeah, okay. But he did die, and John Wesley never got the chance to meet him. But John Wesley had studied so much of Swedenborg's work that he was actually able to do the commentary for a significant portion of the literature. Emanuel's reach, and I've said this before and I will probably say it at least one more time, was vast. He covered so much that even after his death, his writings influenced very important people in a whole range of different works. And science didn't make sense, but if you've read it, if you start reading his work, you'll start to pick out the parts where it comes to this philosophy of psychology. He influenced people such as Robert Frost, Arthur Conan Doyle, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is where it gets interesting. Carl Jung, but oddly enough, not that I could find Sigmund Freud. So it didn't look like Freud read him, but Carl Jung did. Whatever. And the other one, because John Wesley started the Methodist Church, Emanuel Swedenborg's work influenced another church founder. That's Joseph Smith, the founder of LDS and Mormonism. Apparently, he had read a fairly large quantity because Emanuel Swedenborg's work was just coming to the States in the 1840s, when the Fox sisters were doing their thing, when Alexander Jackson Davis was doing his thing, and also when Joseph Smith was doing his thing. And Joseph Smith had, in some historical records, read his work. So that's interesting. Just to see the vast reach. Like this guy who was a mining guy for his entire life started deciding to go through Genesis and Exodus. That's as far as he got with his not so much revision, his interpretation or translation, if you will, of the Bible. In all of the work that he wrote, when he started going over the Bible and trying to explain that there's a deeper spiritual meaning to what was being said here, not just this level. He said there was a deeper level, and that's what he was going into. His study was so intense, he literally got through 2 books of the Torah. That's it. He got through Genesis and Exodus before he died. And from that, he wrote, I believe, almost 20 books associated with that and his new spiritual belief of life. Emanuel's life, though, was not without conflict, and his work had a little bit of it as well. Many spiritual people who did actually read his work and figured out who he was, and a lot of lay people who were not in spiritual community, churches or whatever, confronted him about his challenges to the mainstream belief. How dare you tell me that my or my literal interpretation of the Bible is wrong because my pastor told me. From what I read, he was very calm and gentle, and he told them exactly what he had read. He changed a lot of minds because they came at him from an emotional, angry standpoint, and his well-measured defense of his beliefs opened a lot of people's eyes to maybe things aren't just exactly how they thought. He made it very clear through his life that he never wanted to found a religion. He wanted people to read his work and read the Bible, then make up their own minds as the Spirit guided. He believed that the new church, and that's all he would call it, was a new church, would be one of spirit, not organized, not like the ones of his day, and, well, look around the world today and tell me that they're not all that way now. That was not what he wanted. He found that repulsive because his research proved that church, spirituality is not a building. It's your connection from your heart and soul and your body to the heart, soul, mind, body of the divine that resides above us or within us, around us. Interpret as you will. I found it interesting that Emanuel turned away from the term of philosophy, though. By the end of his days, he wouldn't use the term at all. He said that belief was based on action and experience. And he had experiences and had a lot of action in his life as far as the spiritual world. The ruminations of men, the ponderings of the aged, that was philosophy. That's when you sit back and you just ruminate and you think about, and this is what I think might have happened. He was like, if that's what you got, I don't want it. Because what he had discovered over time was a space that's outside of our normal awareness. But it's not a space we stay in. It is a transitory state. And from what I could understand of it, what we would call the astral plane, which is you check out of your body, you pop up there, you travel, you pop back into this dimension, or you hop into another dimension outside of it, and you go do your thing, you come back, travel back through the astral, and come back in. What they call the Swedenborgian space, that is what I would call the astral plane. It's not physical. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just basically a highway system. And that's kind of what he describes it as. Understanding, I haven't read everything that he wrote because it was massive. I've only read a couple of them. But that's what it comes across to me as. But he explains it in a way that's easy to understand to my mind. Who knows what that means? But it's something that if you ever want to start really delving into what the different layers of reality are as far as a spiritual realm, his work could give you a very good starting point, but it also could bury you with information. So I highly recommend picking and choosing the work that you choose to read. Like if you want the one about the new real Christianity, what the heck's the name of that book? Sorry, The True Christian Religion. Go through that one. It's 800 pages. You'll be there a minute. Probably closer to 900 if you did the math correctly. The earth and the universe and their spirits and inhabitants, which is the ones where he talks to the other beings on the planets in our galaxy or our solar system. That would be an interesting one if you're looking into what other life is in our solar system, because he does talk a lot about that, which is interesting because he talks about beings on Mars that he'd communicated with. If you ever have paid much attention to Nikola Tesla, he references talking to Martians, and that's how he got some of his pretty intense research done, was talking to Martians. So, there's that. If you wanted to look into, let's say, the secrets of heaven, that would be one to understand the spiritual world from a divine standpoint. And then whereas heaven and hell is kind of goes over his basis for you have heaven, you have hell, this is the world in between, this is where all the spirits do their thing. That was probably going to give you the best impression or idea of the basics of what he would call, what we reference towards him, Swedenborgian space or the astral plane. So it kind of gives you the idea of spirits go into this place, fit, and then figure out what direction to go while you're there. It kind of, from what I remember of reading this book, it reminds me a lot of this concept of purgatory, because you go there, you have to see why you're going to heaven or why you're going to hell. You have to experience the lifetime. These are the mistakes. This is what shifted you one way or another. So you get a lot of it can get really personal from what I remember reading that one, because I have read that one. But it's worth looking into if you're wanting to expand your understanding of some of these places. There are many reports of his abilities that were very public. This wasn't like he was doing this in private. This stuff happened to him on a day-to-day basis, just being out and around people. One of the stories that became very popular, and it confused people of his time, and then they started wanting readings from him, and he's like, "That you can do this yourself, figure it out." And it wasn't so rude about it, but that was kind of his way of looking at it, is I can show you how to do this. He saw a fire that started near his home in Sweden. He was in London. It's over 200 miles away. He was, I believe it was at dinner, and he just got really agitated and was just mad that they better get this fire out. He didn't want his house to burn down. Everybody around him was like, "What are you talking about?" 2 days later, a messenger arrived to tell him that his house was saved, 3 houses down, burnt, as well as several houses on the other side of it. Everybody that was around him was like jaw dropped, picking him up off the floor, going, "Wait, that was the exact night that you were having an attitude about it." The spirits don't just tell you about spiritual things. They tend to want to give you heads up about, hey, stuff's going on. You should pay attention. He actually helped find some very lost important documents. A lady her husband had died, so she was a widow, looking for some important paperwork. I had something to do with some financial investment in silver, like a tea set or something along those lines. I don't remember the exact wording because I just put down receipts and will documents. She never found him because her husband was very secretive about where he kept such things, and they were trying to take away her house and basically her property, and that silver at that time was extremely valuable. So he went home and asked the spirits to give him a dream. The next day he goes to this lady and was like, yo, it's right here. She went right to it, found it, and she knew of him, but they were not friends. They did not know each other personally. So for him to be able to describe exactly where those documents were hidden in her house, where her husband had hidden them, that he was the only one that knew, so he obviously was the one that told Emanuel, really shocked this lady, and she was like, so she started telling people. And eventually he started getting requests, can you talk to Great Aunt Fanny and be like, where did she hide the family jewels? And he was able to, with surprising accuracy, complete strangers, because the spirits were in direct communication with him, tell people where this stuff was, different information about family members. He even would reference pet names that were known within the family only, that there's no way he could have known, things like that. And it became very, very, very what do I want to say? Obvious that he was in communication with things on the other side, but he wasn't hiding it. It's just not something that he bragged about. If you came to him and talked to him, he would talk to you. It wasn't a big deal to him. But that's also why I think he wrote so much, is so much was coming through that he had to get it out of here and put it onto paper. And his writings were originally in Latin. That wasn't the language that he was born speaking, but because he felt that these were extremely important works, he'd write them in the language of the Bible, basically. So they were written to be read by important people so that they could not so much like keep this knowledge away, but at the time Latin was a pretty common written language. Even in, like, okay, you're in Sweden, you can still read Latin there, but you can read it in other countries as well. So it was kind of like the common tongue, so having it written in Latin was a way to spread it out as well. But it was also the language that the first Bibles were published into, so more people knew Latin because of that. So it was the common tongue for the time, from what I could understand of going through all this paperwork. His homeland of Sweden was very strict, though. Religious leaders of the time controlled all publication logs. Everything that was published went through the churches. And I believe Catholic was the one that dominated. They wouldn't say in any of the references, surprise, surprise, but from my understanding of the time period and from what I could dig up about, the national religion of Sweden during this time period, it sounded like the Catholics were still in control, very, very strictly control of that area, also having a very heavy hand with the monarchy at the time. So you didn't have a lot of religious freedom. So instead of that, he would have his works published in London, kind of a free-thinking bourgeoisie type mindset where everyone was like, let's just do everything, because London's always been a little bit more progressive to the rest of Europe. But he would also publish work in Amsterdam, which I thought was weird, but they were a pretty big publishing literature area during this time as well. So you had two different places that he would publish so that his work would actually make it to the public, and he wouldn't be charged with heresy, and everything that he had put so much work and time into would be blatantly destroyed by the church, because that's what would have happened if he would have had it published in Sweden. So let me see here. I have a picture, or a painting, it's kind of a wood sketch, of Swedenborg. Make sure there you go. For the time period that he was in, this was kind of a common look for these guys, especially when he started getting into his more spiritual one. He would, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but his curly little locks here was actually a wig. they've powdered their wigs. It's been a thing. And since he was part of a royal charter with his assessorship, that also would have implied, no matter what his hair really was, he would have that wig on because it was a status symbol. So when you go out in public, you usually would have that. Not always, but that was kind of a thing for a while. The wig thing has always made me scratch my head because a white powdered wig makes you look smart. Okay. Anyway. But his ideas and his thoughts on spirituality were extremely far-reaching. Like I said, I wish I would have read these books more recently because it's been a little while, but he was such a gentle person in life. He wrote books on relationships even though he was a lifelong bachelor. A lot of his work, he talks about different forms of diet. People assumed he was vegetarian. No. He had a fair amount of fish. Didn't do pork. That was the one thing that I found a lot with him, is pork was not on his agenda, but he ate a lot of fish. He would eat, was it beef or chicken? One of those two he ate in fairly large amounts. But he would lean more towards a vegetarian conceptual diet, but he still had eggs, he still had, whatever else went along. And it had nothing really to do with God says you must be vegetarian. He was basically saying that there's parts of our subtle energy field, he would call it the soul body, that required less animal life to survive. So it was a way to help bring balance into your energy field, kind of saying that you need a balanced diet. Of course you do. Not medical advice, just that was kind of what he was talking about. But through everything that I read, he wasn't confrontational. Even when he was still doing his scientific research, he would challenge and he pushed people. Prove your point. You are saying this, prove it. But he would do it in such a gentle way that it inspired people to go further. He was going that direction anyway, because he was pushing the bounds. But it was the way he defended what he was talking about that really caught people's attention, and they were like, oh, if I do it this way, and for everything that I was referencing, it was kind of like he would quietly smile and walk away, and that person would be off onto a tangent, totally buried in this new idea. And he did the same thing with the spiritual leaders. They'd come at him just absolutely furious over something that he had written, and he would basically fold his hands and let them get it off their chest, and then he would defend himself and push back. And eventually they didn't have anywhere else to go because he backed them into a corner, and it was a corner of their own making. That's the thing with the research that I've been doing with him that fascinated me. He didn't have to be confrontational. He literally just brought it out there and said, this is what I found. Prove me wrong. And they would come at him with all these things, and he would turn a page and say, prove me wrong. And then he'd turn another page and say, prove me wrong. And most of the time, the people would go away going, I need to learn some more. I thought I knew this subject, and I didn't. And it was kind of fascinating to me, and that's influenced a few of my interactions. I try to be more gentle. Reading over his work, I think that's a better way to be. I also can be really bombastic when I have those arguments. So, and I'm having a discussion with a friend of mine. We're talking about possibly starting a podcast sometime in the future, which would be awesome, but it's going to be me with my alternative spiritual beliefs, and he has much more mainstream beliefs. So it's going to be kind of a push-pull conflict thing, which will be fun, I think. But trying to iron out the details and get it started, and dates and times, and yeah. We both have day jobs. I do this as well. I have my side business with the Mystic Jen Mara. Throw in a podcast. Yeah, sure. But we'll get that one of these days, I think. Hopefully in the next 6 months, but I make no promises because, well, life happens. So, but on that note, I think that is all I have here. If you guys have any questions, comments, even criticisms, drop them in the comments section below. As long as we can be respectful, I'm good with all of it. If you're interested in any of his work, Emanuel Swedenborg's work, There's a bunch of links in the description. Like I said, they're all associate links or affiliate links, something like that, so that each time you make a purchase through one of those links, it actually does help the channel out. It doesn't cost you a thing, which is awesome. Please like the video if you enjoyed this video. If you are enjoying this kind of content, click subscribe. That way you can find out when I go live or drop a new video. If you're on Odyssey, if you click the little follow button, that way you'll know when I'm live there. In theory, I'm not sure exactly how Odyssey's alerts work yet. I'm still trying to figure that one out. Anyway, but yeah, questions, comments, if you have somebody else that you want me to do a little bit more digging into. Some of these guys, there's so much there that I'm having to pick and choose. I could have made Emanuel Swedenborg's video like 4 hours long, and that would have been exhausting. But there's that much, he's that unique of a character. But if there's other people that you are curious about, like I said, I have a list of a whole pile of people. You can drop them in the comments below. We will get to what we can get to. Next week is Myth and Tarot, which is where I'm introducing a mythological creature and then doing a tarot reading for that class of creature. So if you're interested in any of that, please swing by next Monday. This is supposed to be on Monday. Things happen, so we'll go from there. I think that's everything. Valentine's Day is coming up next week, so I also have a little bit of an interesting stream planned for Tuesday, which is Valentine's Day itself. If you're interested, you can check in there. I think it's going to be a tarot reading, but that's all I'm going to say about it. So I will talk to you guys later. Thank you for swinging by and checking out the video, and have a great rest of your evening or morning or whenever you watch this video.